Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. Let's continue our series on Soviet architecture. First, let's talk about the birth of the Socialist Realist method. The Socialist Realist method emerged first in literature. It was adopted at the first Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934 and was developed in particular by Maxim Gorky. In understanding this method, we must first ask, what is realism? Marxism understands realism in art to mean truthfulness. A realistic work reveals the true social relations, true meaning of what it portrays. This definition is somewhat different from the general use of the term realism. In general speech, people usually mean realistic or realism in a more narrow sense, that if something sort of looks like what it's trying to portray, then it's realistic, or they simply mean the realist art movement, which emerged roughly in the late 1800s, but that's a specific art movement, and Marxism uses realism in a more broad sense, although Marxism does consider that the realist art movement is realistic, but it's not the only thing that's realistic. Realism is often criticized these days, especially in visual arts. People say we have cameras, so what's the point of making a realistic painting? Because you could just take a photograph. But they misunderstand the point of realism, and certainly they misunderstand the point of socialist realism, because what they're really criticizing is naturalism. Naturalism means basically mechanically or photographically copying something, copying a situation or events, painting a picture, just meticulously copying every detail from a real-life event, or narrating something that happened in meticulous detail, but without giving the details any meaning or any emphasis or any artistic planning. And what happens with naturalism is that you kind of don't see the forest for the trees. The abundance of meticulously copied details kind of hides what's actually going on. The truth gets lost behind all the minutiae. So socialist realism differs from naturalism because it doesn't just mindlessly copy events or situations. Socialist realism must point the audience's attention to the important events and aspects of the artistic image or situation that they are observing. In other words, realism, and socialist realism as well, tells the audience something. It portrays a message. And this message shouldn't become lost in a sea of details that don't contribute to it. This is especially true because social relations and the truth is often hidden behind a facade of unimportant events. Realism is also the opposite of abstract art. This is because the form of the artwork, that is, its style or its manner of presentation, must correspond to its content, its message and its meaning. Realistic art tries to be clear and truthful, so it needs a clear method of presentation. Clarity, however, is not the same as being simplistic or dumbed down. It simply means the opposite of obscure. Abstract art is obscure because its message is unclear or obscurantist. Cubism, suprematism, and many other abstract movements want to portray some kind of incomprehensible, immaterial spiritual realm. This is a clear example of their obscurantism. They choose an abstract form because what they're trying to portray cannot be portrayed clearly or realistically. There are many other forms of art, such as expressionism or impressionism, which are not quite realistic but still have an undercurrent of realism and are not entirely unrealistic either. There are two kinds of realism: bourgeois or critical realism and socialist realism. Critical realism wants to portray reality in order to criticize it. Socialist realism does that too, but it doesn't only criticize, it also gives a way forward. Socialist realism has a socialist message. As Maxim Gorky said, socialist realism also utilizes revolutionary romanticism and is fundamentally optimistic. Basically, every socialist realist work is fundamentally, at the end of the day, optimistic, because even those socialist realist stories or works which end with the death of the protagonist, they are still optimistic because they end with a firm faith in the victory of socialism, so they have a historical optimism. The culture of the working class society, including its art, must be, quote, socialist in content and national in form, unquote, as Stalin explained already in 1925 in his speech, The Political Tasks of the University of the Peoples of the East. This was incorporated into the definition of the Socialist Realist method. Lenin wrote, quote, "In advancing the slogan of the international culture of democracy and the world working class movement, we take from each national culture only its democratic and socialist elements. We take them only and absolutely in opposition to the bourgeois culture and the bourgeois nationalism of each nation." Unquote. Quote, "International culture is not non-national. Nobody said it was. Nobody has proclaimed a pure culture, either Polish, Jewish, or Russian, etc. The elements of democratic and socialist culture are present, if only in rudimentary form, in every national culture, since in every nation there are toiling and exploited masses, whose conditions of life inevitably give rise to the ideology of democracy and socialism. But every nation also possesses a bourgeois culture, and most nations a reactionary and clerical culture as well, in the form not merely of elements, but of the dominant culture. Our task is to fight the dominant Black Hundred and bourgeois national culture of the Great Russians, and to develop, exclusively in the internationalist spirit and in the closest alliance with the workers of the other countries, the rudiments also existing in the history of our democratic and working class movement. Fight your own Great Russian landlords and bourgeoisie, fight their culture in the name of internationalism." Unquote. Lenin writes in another article, quote, "Is a sense of national pride alien to us, great Russian class-conscious proletarians? Certainly not. We love our language and our country, and we are doing our very utmost to raise her toiling masses, that is 9/10 of her population, to the level of a democratic and socialist consciousness. To us it is most painful to see and feel the outrages, the oppression and the humiliation our fair country suffers at the hands of the Tsar's butchers, the nobles and the capitalists. We take pride in the resistance to these outrages put up from our midst, from the Great Russians, in that midst having produced materialist philosopher and rebel Radishev, the Decembrist rebels, and the revolutionary commoners of the 1870s. In the Great Russian working class, having created in 1905 a mighty revolutionary party of the masses, and in the Great Russian peasantry having begun to turn towards democracy and set about overturning the clergy and the landed proprietors." Unquote. The national form and socialist content of socialist realism naturally emerges from Lenin's idea that culture is national and that every national culture has both progressive aspects, which we must defend and develop, and also reactionary aspects which we must oppose. Lenin says to fight reactionary bourgeois culture, but at the same time both Marx and Lenin also said that the proletariat must critically assimilate and develop all the achievements of human culture throughout history. Lenin said, quote, "Marxism has won its historic significance as the ideology of the revolutionary proletariat because, far from rejecting the most valuable achievements of the bourgeois epoch, it has, on the contrary, assimilated and refashioned everything of value in the more than 2,000 years of the development of human thought and culture. Only further work on this basis and in this direction, inspired by the practical experience of the proletarian dictatorship as the final stage in the struggle against every form of exploitation, can be recognized as the development of a genuine proletarian culture." Unquote. From literature, socialist realism spread to all other forms of art in the Soviet Union and also in other countries. But we must also ask, how does it apply to architecture? Well, it's pretty easy to understand why modernist architecture, which draws inspiration from suprematism and other idealist and non-realistic forms, was immediately recognized as not realistic. It was understood that realism in architecture means most of all understandability, comprehensibility, which is based on the use of classicism and national traditions. Socialist realist buildings were also decorated with socialist and working class symbolism and with ornamentation taken from nature, such as flowers and plants, but also from native folk traditions and from classicism. This easily ties into the national form of socialist art. The abstract shapes created by the constructivist and rationalist architects were totally alien to the people of the Soviet Union. They were usually derived from American imperialist productions, although those were equally alien to the American working class and were only familiar to the corrupt millionaires. Each Soviet nation sought its own national identity and culture and produced its own kind of architecture, combining classical elements, which in a certain sense can be considered universal, and also native elements. Socialist art must also be democratic, which means it must be understandable to the people. This ties together both with the demand for realistic clarity and with the national form. Needless to say, the abstract constructions were more elitist and out of touch with the regular people rather than democratic. In terms of its message or its content, socialist architecture must also be optimistic and monumental in order to truthfully reflect the victorious march of socialist construction. The socialist-built environment would elevate people's class consciousness, inspire their fighting spirit, inspire them with hope for future victories, and with Soviet patriotism and internationalism. Zhdanov said in 1948 that to be an internationalist, one must appreciate their own culture and also other cultures, and that this is possible only if cultures thrive. Such love for one's own culture and for other cultures is facilitated also by powerful national architecture. Zhdanov said, quote, "Internationalism in art does not spring from the depletion and impoverishment of national art. On the contrary, internationalism grows where national culture flourishes." Unquote. Socialist realism recognizes the importance of beauty, and this is crucial for architecture. This is because it is derived from the traditions of the masses, and is also necessary for its optimistic quality. Lunacharsky had been waging a long struggle against ugliness and aesthetic nihilism. He said already in 1926, quote, "It is being said that this is a new stage in human history, that the proletariat is entering the stage of urbanization, that the machine is poetic, that the factory is the most powerful thing that can be seen on earth, that any form of literary tale is a mere mirage compared to the poetic situation in which science brings about a new factory. I do not in any way deny that the proletariat may find original and attractive coloration for its life in poems of productivity, but it has to be said that only futurism and the artists of Lev, the seedbed of constructivism, who are the avant-garde of a leftist Euro-American urban culture, can become wholly immersed in this element. We Bolsheviks have not entered the world in order to finally make the machine the mistress of our lives, as advocates of time and motion study like Gustev are advocating through their socio-political literature. We came in order to liberate the individual from under the power of the machine. Let the rhythm of the machine certainly become an important element in our culture, but the machine cannot be the center of our art." Unquote. So he's criticizing constructivist machine romanticization, which I talked about in a previous episode. Gustev, that he mentions, ran an institute which studied methods of rationalizing work, calculating each labor process to the fraction of a second, subordinating workers to the machines, making them only slaves of the machines. Gustev's left extremism was eventually condemned. Lunacharsky continues, quote, "There exists with us in Russia a vast Euro-American conception of the culture of individual creative work, of that high art which was created by the geniuses, the great talents of Euro-American culture. Certainly, there is a very great deal that can be absorbed from the products of this individual art, but as a whole it is alien to us. Much more nourishing an environment for proletarian art is the mass of vernacular peasant art, that art which developed in the primal period of our ancestors. It is precisely from here that we should draw models. From this art evolved over the course of centuries, which devised a style that is almost irreproachable in the inner rigor and order of its crystallization of form. Despite the fact that it developed while civilization itself was still beginning to emerge, it is precisely this vast body of creativity which can now provide that nutritious environment for proletarian artistic labor because of its multi-valued character and because of the collective nature of the basic principles underlying its products." Unquote. So what is he saying? He's actually hinting at a very important fact, because he says that vernacular folk art, or what he calls peasant art, but it's actually folk art, has a nearly perfect inner rigor and form, because it has been created by the people, and it has been created by the people during a very long time. It has had a long time to develop and become perfected. But what about the best of contemporary art created by professional artists? Lunacharsky by no means denied the absolute necessity to utilize the best of contemporary art and of professional art, in particular the art of Greek and Renaissance classicism. But professional art has always been, to an extent, elite art, something relatively divorced from the people. Lunacharsky doesn't spell this out explicitly, but it is an important fact. Professional styles have developed quickly, while folk art has become perfected slowly. Folk art is in some ways lacking, but was always intimately tied to the people, while so-called high art or professional art has always to an extent been divorced from the people. That is why folk art must serve as an important, maybe the most important inspiration. But this issue is not all that cut and dry, because the best professional artists have also always used folk art motifs. Musicians like Glinka, Mussorgsky, Bach, Beethoven, and really all the great composers have used folk melodies and themes. And especially back in the day, you could pretty much trace all the raw material used by composers in some way to folk art or the art of the people, which they used and then developed them into masterpieces of high art. And as is known, for example, the famous Soviet song Katyusha, orchestrated by Matvey Blanter, and the famous Chinese communist song The East is Red. They both used existing folk melodies as their foundation. Same also applies to architecture. The ancient Greek buildings, and probably all or most classical buildings of all cultures, were originally modeled on the houses and later temples of the regular people. After that they developed to the classical forms, which were then again re-utilized by the Renaissance, and the Renaissance models were then used by later people. So there's no absolute isolation between folk art and high art, there's only a relative degree, or at least there wasn't a total isolation between folk art or art of the people and professional art until relatively recently. Lunacharsky and later the Communist Party were not saying that we have to return to ancient folk art in its ancient form. Socialist realism is not about being archaic or antique. Instead, they were pointing out that most modern capitalist artists have always been, to an extent, separated from the people, that folk art must serve as an important influence, that connection to the masses is crucial, and that really socialist art must achieve what the best artists always sought to do anyway, to combine the art of the masses with high artistic skill, to combine folk art with high art, to take the art created by the masses and then to enrich it, to elevate it into high art. Quote, "The best examples of folk art should become a source of national pride for every Soviet architect. Of course, this does not mean that the architect should limit himself to the assimilation and creative processing of the art of only his people. It is necessary to turn to the best examples of folk art and other art of fraternal national republics. This will not only ensure that the national originality of the works created by the architects will not be lost, but on the contrary, their expressiveness will increase 100-fold." Unquote. It should be noted that although Soviet Socialist Realist architecture drew inspiration from classicism, it is not the same as classicism, or not the same as old classicism. And by the way, I'm using classicism in a broad sense, although the Soviets mostly drew inspiration from ancient Greco-Roman and Renaissance models, so I guess that could be called classicism proper. But anyway, Socialist realism is still not the same as classicism, because classicism is a bourgeois trend if we're talking about the Renaissance classicism, or even a pre-bourgeois trend if we're talking about ancient Greece and Rome. So a socialist society cannot simply use what the bourgeoisie are using, even though bourgeois classicism was developed during the time when the bourgeoisie was still an advancing revolutionary class and not yet a historically outmoded and reactionary class like it is nowadays. But basically, to explain it with an analogy, the relation of socialist realist architecture to bourgeois classicist architecture is pretty similar to the relationship of socialist realism to classic bourgeois realism in literature, for example. Bourgeois realism has largely withered and been overtaken by more obscurantist and decadent imperialist capitalist trends, while socialist realism took all that was best and workable in classic bourgeois realism and has advanced them further. And the same can be said of classicism. As capitalist writer Boris Groys writes, socialist realism utilizes classicism as an inspiration, but not in any kind of archaist way. Socialist realism develops as a superior art of the future instead of advocating some kind of return to the antique past. He writes, quote, socialist realism shows the exemplary and the normative, which are worthy of emulation. Nevertheless, it cannot be considered a new version of classicism, although classical elements may indeed be found in socialist realist artistic compositions. Although antiquity and the Renaissance were highly praised by Soviet critics, the art of socialist realism is without the direct antique stylization so characteristic, for example, of the art of Nazi Germany. Socialist realism judges the reality created in the Soviet Union to be the highest achievement of the entire course of human history, and does not, therefore, oppose the antique ideal to the present as a positive alternative or a utopia already once realized, as has so often been done in West European modern art. The socialist realism of the Stalin period is an original artistic trend with its own specific stylistic features." Unquote. I must say that Groys kinda understands this a bit better than most capitalists, because at least he does admit that socialist realism is a original, authentic artistic trend, whereas a lot of capitalist morons just say that socialist realism is just mindless copying of classicism or something along those lines. However, I have to say that there are more differences between Nazi art and Soviet art, and it's not only the fact that Soviet art looks to the future while the Nazis look to the past. Although this is a significant difference, it's not the only difference. Really, the Nazi art never even pretended to be realistic, and even their use of classic forms was always just gaudy, eclectic pseudo-classicism, a completely vulgarized and degenerated style, and not any kind of genuine return to the old classic forms. Socialist realism uses all that is best in human culture from the entire history of humanity, as Lenin advised. That is another way in which it totally differs from the constructivists and rationalists, which adopted the erroneous position of Zhdanov. Capitalist writer Cooke writes, quote, "This dispute was essentially between Lenin and his reading of Marx's aesthetics and the leader of the newly formed proletarian culture organization Proletcult, Alexander Zhdanov. The Zhdanov faction insisted that the past must be treated as a tabula rasa, or an empty slate or a blank slate, from which proletarian art and culture would be built on entirely new principles. To Lenin, the underlying principle was that of Marx, that everything which was created by humanity before us must be critically assessed, and the treasures of art and science must be made accessible to the whole popular mass." Unquote. So instead of just burning everything to the ground and then somehow inventing everything totally from scratch, and how would we even do that? All of our ideas come from the existing material reality anyway, so how could we even invent something totally from scratch? Instead, Marx and Lenin said that everything that humanity has developed up to this point must be critically assessed and then developed further. The reactionary elements must be discarded, and the progressive elements must be further refined. Then let's cover some more theoretical ideas regarding socialist realism in architecture. Some of these have already briefly been mentioned, so socialist realist architecture should have an optimistic, uplifting feeling, as opposed to an oppressive or a gloomy or boring feeling. In his book Art of Architecture, Chires, for example, refers to the Greek Parthenon as an example of a building that has an upward-pointing, dynamic and optimistic, uplifting feel. Soviet architect Alabyan says, quote, "The Soviet people are the happiest people in the whole world. Therefore, our architecture should be deeply optimistic and joyful. It must instill cheerfulness and confidence in the hearts of millions, ignite them with Bolshevik passion, captivate, excite, call them to new victories. This is one of the main qualities of the true architecture of socialist realism. This is the architectural style corresponding to the spirit of the Stalin era." Unquote. Chires also talks about examples of architectural truthfulness. Pillars should be at least mostly real pillars instead of just having a building that doesn't require columns and then you just slap a bunch of random purely decorative columns on it. Really, if there are arches, the arches for the most part should actually serve a structural purpose. If there are columns, they should serve some kind of structural purpose. If there are stairs, they should lead somewhere. If there are windows, they should lead somewhere. If there are doors, they should lead somewhere. For the most part, this is not an absolute rule, but it's more a general principle. Other things regarding a building's truthfulness, the outside of the building should kind of give you an idea, an indication of what is inside. The inside should be beautiful if the outside is beautiful. And as an example, Chires cites the Colosseum, where he considers that the outside gives a very realistic and accurate depiction of what the function and internal content of the building is. Quote, "The external architecture of the Roman theaters reflects the internal structure of the amphitheater with amazing clarity and truthfulness, and is an example of the brilliant coinciding of truthfulness and the power of artistic influence in the image of the theater building." Unquote. When it comes to the outside of the building and the facade of the building, or like the main front of the building, according to Soviet Socialist Realist principles, the building should also have like a characteristic face. Sometimes if it has a door and like two front windows, it kind of looks like a face, but they literally call it a face. And if it's very confusing, you can't even tell that this is the front of the building, then they would say that it's a faceless building, that it's a confusing, faceless mess. And this is not purely decorative, although it is decorative and aesthetic, but it also serves a function. And that's why functionalism in many ways is kind of a scam, because functionalism usually is not very functional, whereas classicism actually is quite functional. And all these classical things arose out of functions. The function was first, and then the style came out of that during a slow process of evolution. For example, what is the point of a building having a face? Well, it's so that you know what is the front of the building and you know where the door is. But if it's a confusing mess, we've all probably been somewhere, whether it's a public building or what have you, and tried to find, like, where do you go in? And if it's one of these modernist boxes, then it's very confusing. I've even been to some private homes where I accidentally knocked on the back door of the building instead of the front door of the building because it was just like this faceless box. Cooke writes, quote, "In socialist realism, a thing must be what it really is, not pretending to be otherwise. It was thus an important principle that architectural elements must be used for their proper tectonic or structural functions. Arches must span, columns must bear loads." Unquote. Obviously, this shouldn't be taken too literally. Obviously, there can be like little ornamentations that don't actually serve any function, but for the most part. And also, it just looks more harmonious and better if it actually is real and realistic. If you just have a building and then you just slap unnecessary huge columns around it, the columns don't serve any purpose and it kind of shows. But obviously, if you want to build a thing where actually everything fits together into an organic whole and everything serves a purpose and none of the parts are unnecessary, all the parts are needed, well, making a nice, really almost perfect building like that is difficult, so that's why oftentimes people don't achieve that, and sometimes they don't even care to do that. Making great art is difficult. If you don't want to have any difficulties, then I guess don't try to make anything cool. Quote, "In housing, this realism meant elevational treatment, which created an architectural expression out of the proper elements of the housing itself, out of balconies, windows, doorways, rather than from applied elements of false monumentality." Unquote. In other words, let's say you have an empty wall. Instead of slapping like random ornaments on the wall, well, the building needs a door, needs windows, probably needs some kind of balconies or something. Put those in first, try to use those, try to actually use the things that serve some kind of purpose, some kind of functional purpose. Don't just have the functional elements separated and then put on some random ornamentation. No, it should be one thing, and the functional elements themselves should do probably the bulk of what makes it look good. And also, it wouldn't be realistic if the functional elements are just separated. The functional elements have to be the main point of it. but not like in functionalism. Socialist realism also uses a principle which I think comes from the Renaissance and probably originally from Greco-Roman antiquity, but I think it was theorized in the Renaissance that they should integrate different visual arts. So you should have painting, sculpture, and architecture combined into one. Ancient Greek buildings all have that. The statues are all very organically connected to the whole building, to the whole point of the building. And of course, those buildings originally were painted, even though nowadays the paint has mostly eroded away. Quote, "The problem of synthesizing the three arts, architecture, painting, and sculpture, is very relevant for us. Monumental painting and sculpture not only decorate a building, but ideologically enrich it and make architecture more expressive and more accessible to the masses. Meanwhile, many architects resort to painting and sculpture as some random, extraneous elements that have nothing in common with the entire architecture of the building. A striking example is the residential building of the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs on Sadovaya Kudrinskaya. Here, under the bay windows, the architect has stuck a large number of completely random sculptures that only disfigure the building. The great architects of ancient Greece teach us how to practically carry out the synthesis of the three arts. It is difficult to even imagine an ancient architectural image without painting and sculpture, just as ancient painting and sculpture are unthinkable without architecture. In these classical monuments of art, we see an organic, inextricable connection between three related arts. We also have positive examples of synthesis in some of our best architectural works. So, for example, it is impossible to imagine the Soviet pavilion at the International Paris Exhibition, built according to the design of the architect Joffan, without a monumental sculptural group, just as the Palace of Soviets is unthinkable without the monumental sculptural figure of Lenin crowning the building." Unquote. But basically the main idea is that you can and should have decoration, but the decoration should be part of a cohesive whole. It should be an organic part of the building instead of just having, a random building and then you just slap some totally irrelevant decorations on top of it. Imagine that you have a newspaper kiosk and then you just slap some Doric columns on it or something. That would be bad design, that would be in poor taste, would be very kind of silly and weird. So the point is not just to put a bunch of very over-the-top classical ornamentation on everything. Hudson writes, quote, "As Alexandrov explained, architecture was one of the main forms of the materialization, the reflection, of the system of social relations in any stage of history. Thus, architecture was a powerful means for ideological influence on society, mirroring the ruling ideas with concrete constructions. The central problem before architects, therefore, was the idea at the foundation of a construction. Constructivists, Alexandrov declared, had attempted a nihilistic approach to the Soviet Union's architectural inheritance and offered vulgar simplifications. They had tried to remove all richness from a construction and to build in a narrow utilitarian form. Constructivists discarded real people, with their emotions and interests, with their varied spiritual and physical potentials. They had eliminated nature as well, and thus destroyed architectural beauty and expressiveness. Nihilism, he reminded, was an enemy approach to the experience of the past. The true party line in architecture consisted of satisfying the demands of the socialist person. Alexandrov quoted Kaganovich, "The task before Soviet architecture, the means by which to satisfy the socialist person's demands, was the assimilation of the classical heritage." Alexandrov attempted to explain Kaganovich's views by arguing that this assimilation consisted of the harmonizing of the ideas of function, technique, and material. This was not, he insisted, the mere copying of the outward form of old buildings as practiced by architect Zholtovsky, who was a famous classicist. Once more, the crucial concept was the dominating idea, and the only true route to filling a building with the idea of socialism was through larger, monumental buildings and ensembles." Unquote. Quote, "Our Soviet architecture is alien to falsehood, abstract form-making, and all sorts of bourgeois aesthetic antics. Socialist realism in architecture means first of all truthfulness and simplicity. True artistic simplicity has nothing to do with simplification. It testifies to genuine mastery of the entire wealth of content. Pushkin, the Russian national poet, worked hard to achieve a simple form for his brilliant poems. The works of Lenin and Stalin are simple and clear because they are the pinnacle of human thought. The simplicity of the forms of an architectural structure means, first of all, the beautiful harmony of these forms, which in turn is an expression of the most perfect proportions and relationships of individual elements. Socialist realism is not a system of abstract norms and canons. Narrowness and limitations by their very nature are alien to the method of socialist realism. It is the method of socialist realism that opens up unlimited possibilities for the architect to enrich his artistic language, creativity, and understanding of various styles, unquote. And that is perhaps another criticism of typical bourgeois classicism, is that classicism oftentimes has very strict rules, and that in the history of art eventually became actually quite a hindrance and a limiting factor, especially in literature, so that finally classicism in literature was replaced by romanticism, and later on by things like critical realism and then socialist realism. And because of those rigid rules, classicism can actually eventually turn into its opposite. It can actually turn into formalism. Formalism is oftentimes modernist, worship of making weird-looking buildings just for its own sake, only form, no content, or at any rate the form dominates, but it actually doesn't have to be modernist. Even classicism can be used like that. You know, all these ideas that the classical forms are not tied to any time or place, they're not tied to any culture, but you can just use the same exact model in every place, every time, for every culture, every country. You don't have to take into account the purpose of the building, you don't have to take into account the material, you don't have to take into account the building technology that we have, you don't have to take into account the national form, you can just build temples of Giza and Parthenons everywhere. Then you're actually turning classicism into formalism, which some bourgeois hacks actually have done. Quote, Socialist realism in architecture means the harmonious union of the ideology and truthfulness of artistic concept with the closest possible correspondence of each building to the technical, cultural, and practical demands made on it. The socialist realist method is not defined by any firmly delineated formal characteristics or techniques, and it therefore does not reject the technique of any of the styles of the past, where these are progressive, and provided they are skillfully and creatively applied to the modern conditions in which the socialist nations are developing. Unquote. Cooke writes, quote, At the scale of the overall building, this wholeness implied prostota, its simplicity and clarity, as a total form. Buildings with wholeness were identifiable as entities. They were simple and memorable masses. They were certainly not the fragmented organisms that resulted from modernist functional planning. When the final Palace of Soviet designs were identified as being clear, this referred to a clearly expressed entrance and front, as well as a clear three-dimensional shape. Buildings without a front were called bezlikovye, literally faceless. They were a bezobrazzi, a formless mess, without iconic image or obraz. A confident, radiant society reflected its certainties through obrazi, or artistic images, of clear form and clearly understood meaning. According to the Marxist-Leninist principle of cultural continuity on which socialist realism was based, these obrazi, or images, were forms that resonated in the population's consciousness, with references to cultural myths that were deemed progressive and therefore served as the cultural bridge between their own cultural heritage and the radiant Soviet future. Was it really the case, as Hudson concludes, that by the time of the First Congress of Soviet Architects in 1937, that Alabyan and the party group had succeeded in destroying the spirit of experimentation and creativity that had marked the years of modernism in Soviet architecture? As in all areas of culture, the curtain had closed on the dreams of the revolution, only the nightmare of Stalinism remained. In my reading of the buildings and the profession's own critiques, this was not the case. On the contrary, it leads one to value rather positively the debates actually being conducted in both design work and critical commentary. Unquote. So Cooke is another author who actually tries to make a serious attempt to understand and study socialist realism. And she realizes that socialist realism is not just some BS, meaningless mumbo-jumbo. It's actually a real artistic method and a real style. And they weren't just debating nothing. They weren't just arguing for no reason, or purely for some kind of narrowly political reasons. No, they were actually genuinely discussing and arguing about art. And this topic has not actually been researched by capitalist historians very much at all. There's not that many books about this in English, and most of the historians who write about this, they're either lying on purpose or they're too incompetent or too lazy to actually look into it deeply enough. They just dismiss it out of hand and don't even put in a real effort to study it. Because in all these books, for example in the book Stalinist Architecture, they always say, oh, this is a famous example of socialist realism, this is what socialist realism looks like, and then it's a picture of this apartment building built by Zhdanov on the Mokovaya. That building actually was always heavily criticized. Now, it's not ugly or anything, it doesn't look so terrible, it looks a bit weird, but it was generally seen as a failure. But none of those books ever mention it. They always act like, oh, this is a stereotypical socialist realist building. It's really not. It was considered a failure, even though Zhdanov was a famous architect and a very successful architect. But he also occasionally faced heavy criticism because he kind of had leanings towards just bourgeois classicism. Sometimes he didn't really do socialist realism. He just did bourgeois classicism, like a very mechanical classicism. And Cooke says that the reason so many commentators talk about that building is because they're ignorant, and also because that building is in an easy location, so you can just easily go there and see it, and that's that. They don't bother to actually try to find the buildings that were more representative of socialist realism, which just shows the truly lamentable level of capitalist research. So Cooke writes, quote, in almost any study of this period, two buildings prominently featured as canonical examples of socialist realism are Ivan Zholtovsky's apartment building of 1934, so-called on the Mokovaya, and the Revolution Square metro station of 1938, designed by Dushkin in collaboration with the sculptor Matvei Manitzer. In the criticism of the time, however, neither of these was seen as contributing to the canon. On the contrary, both were pilloried as examples of failure to fulfill important demands of socialist realism. The Zholtovsky was consistently slammed as a mindless literal copying of Palladio, without even a gesture to the principle of assimilating history critically. And I will put here a picture of, this is what the Zholtovsky building looks like, and this is what a building by Palladio looks like. So they said that he's just mindlessly copying it, and not critically assimilating it. Cooke continues, the giant order, in other words, the giant columns, absurdly unrelated to the building's internal spaces, was deemed entirely inappropriate as a solution to monumentality in a residential building where this quality should grow out of the real functional elements of housing. Like I said, it looks a bit odd. The columns look way too big, they look out of place. They're entirely unnecessary, first of all, but it's not really ugly or anything. But it's still, not the way to go. Cooke continues, the Revolution Square Metro was an equally prestigious project on an equally central site. This was seen as an example of failure to achieve that synthesis of the depictive arts with architecture which made the building ideologically active. This was another key principle of socialist realist architecture. Manitzer's figures of revolutionary fighters were widely applauded, but the critics recognized that the sculptures stood in a static architectural space which neither acknowledged their presence nor reinforced their dynamism. The result was not a synthesis of the arts. The total work did not transmit to the metro traveler any sensation of the revolutionary action of 1917. Even today, the sculptures remain as attractive. But the point wasn't that, put some attractive sculptures there. No, it was supposed to be a cohesive work of art where you go into this room and it feels like it communicates to you a sense of what the revolution was like. Cooke continues, only the criticism of the time reveals that the aspirations underlying such executed works were considerably more sophisticated, unquote. So, in other words, the criticisms given by various Soviet artists and politicians and philosophers, they were real sophisticated criticisms. They were much more than just, this looks modern, therefore I don't like it, or you're a Trotskyist, therefore I don't like it, or some random stuff like that. No, they were actually substantive points. Quote, Georgy Goltz, a pupil of Zholtovsky and an architect with the most demanding standards, listed the STO building among his choice of the 4 finest works of Soviet architecture. He said, we now have a good and true new architecture of our own. It is epitomized by the STO building. that is the Labor and Defense Building, the Metro, the Moscow Canal, and the exhibition, that is the National Economy exhibition, he declared at the 1940 Conference of Moscow and Leningrad Architects, unquote. Quote, "The issue of originality is central to the aesthetic program of Socialist Realism. Socialist Realism was not about regurgitation. It was crucially about the constant invention of new obrazi, new images, to embody and transmit messages and myths to audiences who were themselves always moving forward as their political consciousness and aesthetic sensibilities developed. The role of the artist as vedishi, as literally leading forward this mass consciousness, derives directly from this vision of art as active in this ideological advance. Such a role was sharply contrasted to the avant-gardists' pursuit of personal whims," unquote. So art wasn't just, oh, I just want to express myself and I just want to do something that I think is fun. No, you're leading people to communism. You're trying to elevate people's class consciousness, and part of that is also elevating their cultural level, their artistic level. Because, quote, "Socialist realism was a method and not a style, true originality was valued highly. We see these filters of flexibility and appropriateness being applied in the official critique of their own new buildings. Thus, a building with newer features, now in the so-called canons, Vladimir Zabolotny's Supreme Soviet of the Ukraine of 1940, was held up as an exemplar of these qualities and applauded with the Stalin Prize. On the other hand, Noy Trotsky's Moscow District Soviet headquarters in Leningrad of 1936-40, whose accessible location makes it much featured in Western literature, was slated by critical opinion at the time for a banal and pretentious applied monumentality that has nothing to do with the democratic openness which should characterize Soviet local government. It won no prizes," unquote. Okay, and then lastly, I'll just quickly talk about monumentalism. In episode 1, I mentioned Lenin's idea of monumental propaganda, and also throughout the other earlier episodes, I briefly talked about the fact that the built environment obviously has an ideological content. It's putting forward an ideological message, and monumentalism should put forward an optimistic message, the sense that we're building a new, better world. This is what Bazdarev writes, quote, "It was the time when central avenues of the city got reconstructed and its subway network increasingly expanded. In 1937, the Moscow Volga Canal went into operation. In 1939, the Agricultural Exhibition Center was opened in northeast Moscow. All the construction objects of that period impress by their resounding social nature. Lenin's plan of monumental propaganda was being put in practice with such pathos and reach that Ilyich could not even have dreamed it in the difficult 1920s. The image of a socialist city was to inspire the working masses and to pre-admire the harmonious, goal-oriented and beautifully noble life of the future communist society already today. The Renaissance principle of the synthesis of various branches of art was put to practice. The best creative powers of architects, artists, sculptors, engineers were thrown at the task of beautifying socialist urban space," unquote. And even though he was actually quite famous for his classicist works, quote, "Rather than emphasizing the classics, Shkusev argued that Soviet architecture had much to learn from the technology of the West, especially from America in construction materials and in interior fitting of the buildings. Such knowledge, Shkusev warned, in no way could come from a study of the classics. What Soviet architecture should learn from the classics, Shkusev proposed, is its emphasis on realism, nature, humanity, and harmony. Nonetheless, Shkusev accepted the Stalinist emphasis on monumentalism, proclaiming that only socialist society allowed the possibility of constructing on a more monumental scale than even Rome," unquote. So here too you can see that the idea wasn't just mechanical copying, but instead a more nuanced view and learning a more profound message from the ancient Greeks, and stressing that we don't need to be archaic and we should use modern technology. That's a very good point. And Lunasharsky writes, quote, "Thus the general character of the socialist city will present itself as a disciplined unit of great diversity. In the center of the main square, we are discussing a typical city, will be concentrated all the buildings in which is located the real heart of the entire city. Here will be the greatest monumentality, the greatest variety of forms. This will be the architectural center of gravity of the city. From here, in radii and rings, will be arranged the wide streets, perhaps interrupted from time to time by gardens, boulevards, special squares, pools of water fountains, etc." Unquote.